Good evening. My name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to the first of our three-part series on holiday imagery. Tonight we're talking about Passover, and later in the year we'll do Thanksgiving and then Christmas. Now let me tell you a little bit about the discussion, or the lecture. Julie Harris is an art historian, a Glencoe resident, and a specialist in the art of medieval Iberia, who has taught art history at Northwestern University and Skidmore College, among others. She was recently awarded a Center for Spain in America Fellowship at the Clark Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts, for her project on the decorative carpet pages of Iberian Hebrew Bibles. Her publications have appeared in numerous academic journals. She's also part of an international team of scholars researching medieval treasures in Spain. She did a series of art discussions called Mirror Images for us in 2022. It's really nice to have you back, Julie. It's also really great that you were able to get back from Spain yesterday, despite the hurdles that tried to keep you there. And I'm going to let you take it from here.
The illuminated Haggadahs of medieval Iberia are some of the most personal manuscripts made for medieval book owners. This personal nature stems from their function. Haggadahs were designed to be used at home by Jewish families as they conduct their Seders, the ritual meal held on Passover Eve and the following night, which is conceived to preserve the memory of God's deliverance of the Israelites from servitude in Egypt. Although the word Haggadah means the telling, the method employed by this book does not involve a straightforward reading of Exodus. Far from it. Every year in Jewish households around the world, Haggadahs, or Haggadot in the Hebrew plural form, choreograph and animate proceedings which can and indeed should be at times spontaneous, unscripted, and full of expansive debate. Precisely why the Haggadah broke away from its traditional place in the Mahzor, the composite book containing various holiday liturgies, and became a standalone, richly decorated manuscript in the late 13th or early 14th century is much debated. Certainly, a lot can be explained by a general impulse to illuminate that permeated most European urban centers from the second half of the 12th century forward. Illuminated books, decorated books, became status symbols, and there were enough wealthy and literate people of all faiths to commission them. Illustrations were added, one might even say expected, to be present in all sorts of books. That Jews should participate in this trend should surprise no one, and it should surprise us only if we are unaware that the biblical prohibition against images was historically contingent and widely interpreted. The Haggadah's personal nature is evident in its decoration. In concert with the Seder's commemorative and educational focus, most surviving examples contain a biblical narrative series featuring key moments of Exodus, although in some examples, this series is expanded even to include scenes from Genesis. Images of the ritual foods associated with the Seder are also present. You can see the matzah on the left, but it's a bit abstracted. It's almost iconic in form. There are other images, such as those of the rabbis whose voices the Haggadah preserves, and those of the four sons whose personality types and their visual expression derives from the Haggadah's effort to address different types of students at the Seder table. In contemporary parlance, we might call these different learning styles, but there is more to it than that. And we can learn a lot about social types and communal expectations when we study the four sons. Most essential to the topic at hand, however, are the number of images in the Haggadahs that depict a contemporary community's preparation for and observance of Passover. And we see some of those here. For example, we see apparently contemporary, meaning medieval, people cleaning their homes in advance of the holiday, making certain to remove all vestiges of items containing leavening. The observance is directed first in the Bible, and it was later enumerated by generations of rabbis. We see the preparation of unleavened bread, the matzah, and its dispersal among the people of the community, along with another ritual food, the fruit-based charoset, activities which were communally situated in medieval Iberia. So the whole community would come and get some of these foods. And of course, we see the Seder table, the Seder itself, the food served on all the family's best tableware, the table draped with a fine cloth, well-dressed celebrants of all ages in attendance. Haggadahs themselves are present on the festive table, consulted by male family members. Such material would seem to be fertile ground in which to indulge that mainstay of art historical methodology known as patronage, but for the single fact that only one of the extant Iberian Haggadahs contains a colophon, and it is in such poor shape that it can barely be read even under ultraviolet light. Additionally, no 13th or 14th century contract tells us who copied, decorated, commissioned, or used these manuscripts. While art historians working, for example, on this portrait in London's National Gallery could tell you that the sitters are a Mr. and Mrs. Andrew, and that the artist Thomas Gainsborough was a young man about 23 years of age when he painted the couple in 1750. They could tell you that the sitters are members of the landed gentry shown on their estate, next to an oak tree, which, according to the Wikipedia entry I consulted in preparing this talk, still survives. I can say very little about who appears in the pages of an illuminated Haggadah, who made the manuscript, either text, the scribe, or image, the artist, who paid for it, who used it, or even its eventual trajectory from a medieval household to the manuscript's room of a modern library. Coming as it does from the 18th century, the Gainsborough portrait you see does not make for a very fair comparison to a Hebrew liturgical manuscript of the late 13th or early 14th century. I present the portrait as an example to show you how art historians usually are able to gather information on patronage. And I don't mean by reading Wikipedia. For one thing, we know a lot about this painting because it remained in the Seders family until 1960, something that's unlikely, if not impossible, in the case of illuminated Haggadot, given the expulsion of Iberia's Jews in 1492 and other tragedies that befell Jewish book owners and their material goods. Needless to say, in general, the 18th century is much more forthcoming about its population, especially those of the upper class. In the case of this portrait, both artists and sitters were well known. They conveniently left a paper trail for historians to consult. Even the landscape depicted in the portrait itself may still be visited, while little remains standing of Jewish Iberia. The point I'm trying to make is obvious, even if I'm cheating a little bit by comparing a liturgical manuscript to an 18th century oil painting, a genre and a medium that had not yet been invented when our Haggadahs were being assembled. But even if we were to replace the Gainsborough portrait with a medieval manuscript, a book of hours, perhaps, we would still be on firmer footing when it came to the business of patronage than we are with medieval Haggadahs. This talk will examine the thorny problem of the Haggadah's apparently undetermined patronage and offer a few examples of the kind of detective work it requires of art historians. And must be said at the outset, and in the interest of full disclosure, that the genre may not have always been anonymous. Detailed analysis of how surviving books were put together, something that's called codicology, has revealed that they may have once carried colophons, which were lost when the final pages of the manuscript themselves disappeared. Was this deliberate, you may ask? I don't know. But many illuminated Haggadot have incomplete final choirs or gatherings, or are missing them entirely. And this is where we would expect, usually, to find the colophons. As demonstrated by Israeli scholar Malachi Beit Aryeh, there was an unusually robust tradition of owner-produced manuscripts in Jewish Iberia. Many manuscripts, other than the Haggadahs, still contain their colophons. His census includes all manuscripts, both with illuminations and those with no illuminations, but the finds are notably rich in the realm of illuminated Bibles, which are roughly contemporary with the Haggadot and are today represented by some 30 examples. About 30 illuminated Iberian Hebrew Bibles exist. There are many more Hebrew Bibles, but 30 with significant illumination. Sometimes the scribes even give us a bit too much information in their colophons. In their Cervera Bible, which you're looking at now, made around 1300 in Spain, the scribe Samuel ben Abraham ibn Nathan tells us that he lived for 1 year in the town of Cervera and wrote the volume while his broken tibia healed. 15 or so folios beyond the manuscript's scribal colophon and terminating the book appears the rarest of magical beasts, an exception that proves the rule. An artist's colophon reading, I, Joseph Hatzorfati, Joseph the Frenchman, illustrated this book and completed it. Art historian Eva Freumovich has recently discussed the phenomenon of owner-produced Bible manuscripts. While there is no mention of artists in the manuscript she presents, their colophons, and here's one example she writes about, attest to the act of copying rather than the act of patronage, which in both cases must have involved considerable time and expense. These scribal colophons should be understood as responding to the mitzvah, the positive commandment of copying one's own Torah, which was codified by Maimonides and repeated by many other rabbis. In medieval Spain, medieval Iberia, this was extended to the act of copying one's own Bible codex. According to Freumovich, the act of copying one's own Bible was more significant even than paying for it, even if this patronage involved hiring and paying for accomplished illuminators. Furthermore, she sees that these owner-produced Bibles, which were made in the Iberian cultural orbit, that means also in southern France, she sees them as cues to the performance of a completely constituted social identity, as Jewish, as a member of a particular social stratum, as also a member of the Catalan, Aragonese, or Majorcan culture. Like the biblical craftsman Bezalel, whose name means in the shadow of the Lord, the medieval artists who fashioned the Haggadot also remain in the shadows. Although many medieval Bibles copied in Iberia contain colophons, no Iberian Haggadah contains a secure, contemporary colophon naming the patron, the scribe, or the artist. The bold signature of ultra-Pyrenean artist Joseph the Frenchman is an anomaly in a field where signatures of scribes predominate, if we have signatures at all. If traditional artist signatures once existed in the Iberian Haggadot, they no longer survive. Artistic innovation there is unclaimed, and even when located by the art historian, it will likely remain anonymous. It is possible to approach the patronage of Iberian illuminated Haggadot on 2 levels, and this is what I hope to do in my remaining time. The first level concerns patronage of the genre as a whole, and the second level concerns patronage of individual manuscripts. We will begin with the first. What sort of people were responsible for the creation of the illuminated Haggadah as a genre? Apart from the reasonable supposition that the patrons of these manuscripts were Jewish and wealthy enough to pay for a deluxe book, there is no consensus about who they might have been. Years ago, while working on the splendid Golden Haggadah, and you can see it here on the screen, art historian Bezalel Narkis advanced the idea that the models for biblical illuminations in the Iberian Haggadot were to be found in the full-page miniatures attached to Gothic Psalters, books of Psalms, owned by members of Europe's noble classes, particularly the French. According to Narcisse, affluent Jews connected with royal and aristocratic families who owned these manuscripts were imitating the cultural habits of Christian nobility when they fashioned the illuminated Haggadah. The comparison works well with the golden Haggadah, which you see before you, and its eponymous shimmering illuminations, but perhaps not so well with other examples. The Iberian court Jews as Haggadah patrons are evoked by another author, but with a different focus on the manuscript's message rather than on its artistic models. According to Michael Batterman, who wrote a dissertation at Northwestern about 20 years ago, the illuminated Iberian Haggadah owes its existence to the patronage of Jews in high positions in the royal administrations of Iberia. And they developed its narrative iconography to validate their authority when their capacity to serve the kings were being severely restricted. The genre of the Iberian Haggadah, then, is a response to political and social turmoil, to a diminishment of their patron's power. A particular focus on Moses, or in the case of the Golden Haggadah, Joseph as well, would seem to support this thesis, since it relies on locating models of leadership, famous Jewish leaders, in the illuminated Haggadah's visual narrative as a motive for the genre's development. Another art historian, Katrine Kojman-Appel, in a series of works published between 2000 and 2011, and in fact, she's just returned to the topic, also creates a particular social cohort with the illuminated Haggadah as a genre's creation. But her research concludes that the illuminated Haggadot were created for a scholarly contingent in direct conflict with the court Jews. Kojman-Appel's response to Batterman's thesis employed scholarship in intellectual history, which outlined the deep divisions in Iberian Jewish society regarding its attitudes towards Maimonides and his followers. The tensions arose in Jewish communities in Iberia and southern France, whose Jewish communities were culturally affiliated to those in Iberia, concerned how one should read and understand the Bible. Many of these communities were vehemently opposed to Maimonides' allegorical, rationalistic, philosophical approaches to the Bible, which derived from his upbringing in Islamic Spain, where Aristotelian philosophy had permeated religious discourse among elite thinkers. In Kojman-Appel's view, the Haggadah's narrative series, its narrative scenes, many of which were infused with rabbinic legends known as midrash, were fashioned precisely to oppose these allegorical and rationalist interpretations of the Bible. So they were opposing what Maimonides was doing. And that in these attitudes, this favoring of Maimonides was a courtly contingent favored him. So the very group that one scholar credits with creating the Haggadah, another sees it as being in opposition. Notably, Kojman-Appel links these ideas regarding patronage to the stylistic features of Iberian manuscripts produced for Jews. The non-figural Islamicizing elements found in Bibles, and you see the Damascus Keter on the screen there, that can be connected, according in her theory, to those in the Maimonides camp and reflect his Andalusi, Islamic-infused intellectual heritage, while the Haggadah, with their midrashic-infused figural compositions, are connected to members of the anti-Maimonides camp, followers of another rabbi, the famous Nachmanides, and reflect the figural arts of northern regions where these ideas dominated. There were a number of problems with this hypothesis. Without going into too much detail, I will say, when Batterman wrote his dissertation regarding the Iberian Haggadah via the lens of the court Jew was perfectly reasonable. not just because we know that this group had the requisite financial and social resources to have these books made, but also because they had long been prominent in historical studies of Jewish Iberia. It is always easier to attach works of art to people who appear in the historical record. As I stated earlier, no document or contract survives in which a medieval individual explains why he or she wants an illuminated Haggadah, or how it was made, or by whom. But we have plenty of real estate transactions, tax rolls, letters regarding trade, and even historical chronicles in which the courtly class is mentioned. The pairing of illustrations with writings in Hebrew, in this case secular writing, is attested to by their retention in early printed editions of the Meshal HaKadmoni, written by Isaac ibn Sahula. This is a book of parables, which was originally composed in Castile in 1281. And this is precisely the same place and period in which we believe the Haggadah to have been first illustrated. Although no illustrated versions of Ibn Sahula's work survive in manuscript form, only in early printed book form, the illustrations in these later printed editions are believed to have been based on the lost manuscript exemplars. In his introduction, Isaac ibn Sahula justifies the inclusion of images in the following manner. Likewise, methinks, the pictures which conjoint I place with text they illustrate should point the moral and retain the interest of children, while for those that are oppressed by cares, providing light relief through art, thus peradventure they shall find their heart drawn to essentials by my goad, lay aside their Homer, and will put away what heretics and what free thinkers say. Writers on the illuminated Haggadah have long speculated on the motivation behind the inclusion of images in a manuscript format that for so many generations had remained simple text, unelaborated or memorized. The putative illiteracy of women and young children at the Seder as a motivation for the Haggadah's illuminations has been a fixture of related scholarship almost from the beginning. And it's Narkes who said, other less exalted reasons, artistically speaking, for the addition of a series of pictures to the Haggadah were the need to instruct women and children in the history of Israel and to keep the children awake during the long ceremony of Passover Eve. Narkis's explanation would seem to find correspondence in Ibn Sahula's justification for including images in his parable book, the Meshal HaKadmoni. They should retain the interest of children, as well as in conjunction with the text, point to the moral. Finally, for those that are oppressed by cares, the illustrations will provide light relief through art. And here, just for a moment, I will insert our dramatic peacock from the Mokkada Haggadah, because I didn't want to disappoint anybody. I put him in for a minute. The peacock appears just after the Haggadah relates the story of the famous 5 rabbis of Bnei Barak, who spent the entire night discussing the Exodus from Egypt. They were so engrossed by their discussion that they didn't realize that morning was breaking. Now, without being able to read the Hebrew words highlighted by parts of the peacock's body, one could easily interpret its dramatic posture as a commentary on the lengthy nature of the Seder. After all, the 5 rabbis of Bnei Barak, who appear on the page before, who discuss the Exodus all night long, are a model for contemporary Seder participants to emulate. We have just heard their story on the previous folio. It was introduced by the following words beginning on the bottom third of the page before that and finishing on the top 2 lines of folio 22. Therefore, even if we are all wise, we are all understanding, we are all elders, we all know the Torah, we are obligated to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and all who relate the Exodus from Egypt are praiseworthy. Now, Iberian Haggadah manuscripts do not contain the Hebrew phrase v'chol hamarbeh, everyone who increases the telling, which was meant to modify the retelling of Exodus. This is a later formulation argued for by David Aburdacham, who wrote in Seville in 1340, so slightly after these Haggadot are decorated. Not all of them, some of them are contemporary for this. But even in the unmodified form found in these manuscripts, the text makes the underlying principle of retelling and expanding on Exodus clear. We should imagine an extended period devoted to a spirited narration of Exodus, as well as to the questions prompted by it. Indeed, the Mishnah anticipates the possibility that children may fall asleep during the Seder. Rabbi Yehuda suggests offering them roasted grains and nuts on Passover Eve so that they will not sleep. Maimonides, the rationalist, imagined that even adults may have difficulty staying awake. He offered guidance in the event that one, several, or even all members in attendance fell into a sound slumber. Thus, whether dead, exhausted, or throwing a flamboyant tantrum, the peacock's reaction to the proceedings can be seen as modeling that of certain hungry and tired Seder participants as they prepare themselves for what promises to be a very long night. Here is a Haggadah decoration doing precisely what art historians have argued it was designed to do: entertain. And it does via an anthropomorphized creature who steps beyond its decorative role to become a comically empathetic commentator on the proceedings. Now, let us continue with the category of patronage study, which considers individuals and their manuscripts rather than just the entire genre. Passover observance and the Haggadah itself have remained relatively unchanged over the ages. When art historians look at the manuscripts today, some 700 years after they were made, we seek to identify with our medieval counterparts, sometimes to the point of forgetting that, like Victorian Christmas cards and even many family photographs today, the Haggadah's images are better characterized as projections of a sought-after ideal rather than scientific observations of reality. Surely this desire to identify with our medieval compatriots or counterparts is basic human nature. But the act of identification is deeply embedded in Passover itself. As the Haggadah states, in each and every generation, a person is obligated to view himself as if he personally came out of Egypt. Thus, while most contemporary scholarship on these manuscripts orchestrates the notion of their patronage based on a belief that their medieval patrons and viewers would indeed see themselves, we don't know who they are. When describing the design of the Haggadah, Mark Michael Epstein uses the term authorship, which he defines as a collaboration between Jewish patrons who sponsored and conceptualized the manuscript, and in some cases it's seen with the aid of rabbinic advisors, and artists, either Jewish or non-Jewish, who executed the commission. Whether or not we embrace the term authorship, or the degree to which Epstein feels it obtains, there is no question that some degree of personalization is visible in these manuscripts. It became fairly clear early in the study of the Iberian Haggadah that some manuscripts were very closely related to one another, close enough to employ the term of sibling manuscripts when talking about them. At times, the sibling connection or construct distorts the scholarship a bit. Nevertheless, what you're looking at here, the Rylands Haggadah and its sibling, the Brother Haggadah in London, and the Golden Haggadah and its sibling, the Sister Haggadah, offer useful examples for our project today. Both the Rylands Haggadah in Manchester University's John Rylands Library and the Brother Haggadah in the British Library in London conclude their biblical narrative series with apparently contemporary scenes of holiday preparation and observance. Looking at the Seder scenes of the pair depicted on the lower register of each folio, it is obvious that the family makeup has been reconfigured. Thanks to an intensive analysis by Kodjo and Appel, it is now accepted generally that the Rylands manuscript followed rather than preceded the brother manuscript. But whichever manuscript took precedence as a model, it is a simple matter to imagine the patron configuring the Seder scenes to the specifics of his or her own family in order to see themselves observing Passover. The brother Haggadah depicts a family of 4 performing the Seder, an older couple on the left and a younger couple on the right. A single servant in the foreground is in attendance. In contrast, the Rylands Haggadah Seder scene includes 2 servants, but only 3 celebrants, a mother and daughter on the right and a mature man, the father perhaps on the other side. Can we imagine a patronage scenario for this manuscript? What information might have passed between the patron and his artist designer? Let's imagine the mature man on the right is the patron. He's lost his wife. He would like to commission a wedding gift for a young couple on the left who are setting up their own household and would cherish an illuminated Haggadah. He initiates a conversation with the artist, developing the images according to his requirements. Were 5 figures part of the contract, thus necessitating the extra servant? We don't know. It's just a scenario we could consider. A comparison of the golden Haggadah, the second pair, reveals a striking alteration. And I'm just going to show you the golden here for a moment. The golden Haggadah is arguably the most sumptuous surviving Iberian Haggadah, and it doesn't have a Seder scene at all. The narrative sequence ends in a folio whose 4 panels depict Miriam's dance, as well as 3 apparently contemporary scenes of activities related to Passover: the communal distribution of ritual food, the meticulous cleaning of the house, in which the man of the house is an active participant, the preparation of roasted lamb. In contrast, a separate bifolium bound into the closely related sister Haggadah depicts a Seder scene with a centrally placed, outwardly gazing young woman. In the image, the men at the Seder table engage with the Haggadah volumes before them, but the women do not. This depiction of a Passover Seder may reflect low literacy rates among Jewish women in Iberia, or it may reflect the fact that meaningful visual models for literate religious Jews, rabbis, for example, were exclusively male. At the Seder table, the woman in blue listens to the discussion taking place among the menfolk to her right, crossing her hands passively on the table. In contrast, the centrally seated woman in pink raises a finger in front of her lips while glancing out at the viewer. What does this enigmatic gesture mean? Is she asking for silence from her male companions, or silence from the viewer as she impatiently and self-consciously jumps ahead to the next step of the Seder by stealing a taste of the charoset on display in front of her? Whichever answer we prefer, her prominent place in the illumination makes this young woman impossible to ignore. Was the manuscript made for her and her future husband? Possibly the man seated next to her who also glances our way? It's a simple matter to imagine a buyer requesting this change in order to personalize a nearly completed Haggadah displayed in a workshop. The problem for art historians is that in the absence of supporting documentation, we know nothing about how this actually occurred. The final part of this presentation offers the possibility that indications of patronage in the Haggadot rarely or never assumed the form of written signatures, colophons, but were instead expressed visually. Many of these manuscripts, like those made for Christian patrons, contain heraldry, heraldic devices. While efforts have been made to connect these devices to the shields of the crown of Aragon or Castile, connecting them to specific families has been challenging. For example, the Sarajevo Haggadah contains a coat of arms on folio 3. According to Narcisse, the heraldry contains an escutcheon associated with the family of Saints and the Rose of Margaret of Aragon, but I was unable to trace the attribution beyond this offhand suggestion made in an early article written by an antiquarian. I think he just picked it up and went with it without any proof. Regarding another manuscript in the British Library, he identified a coat of arms as being connected to the city of Barcelona, supplying this Haggadah with its popular moniker, the Barcelona Haggadah. Recently, the same shields have been interpreted by another scholar as pointing to a region in France, not Barcelona at all. The heraldry thus may indicate the geographical situation of the manuscript's patrons or makers rather than being attached to a precise familial identity. It may be possible to imagine, or useful to imagine, this heraldry as bearing witness to a much desired but impossible nobility on the part of its patrons. Jews could not join the nobility. Thus, they are status symbols, but empty of true content. Furthermore, some of the shields in these manuscripts have not been completed, as if the makers were awaiting direction from the prospective viewers. The decoration of another Iberian manuscript, Haggadah, may also offer clues about its origins, but decoding these clues requires some additional detective work. The so-called Hispano-Moresque Haggadah is believed to have been made in Castile in the late 13th or early 14th century. It may be our earliest surviving witness to the genre altogether. Turning its pages carefully, we find embedded in its Exodus series another story that may shed light on the manuscript's patronage. My work on this manuscript interpreted an odd image embedded in the biblical sequence as a betrothal. We'll see this in a minute. Identification of the two families joined in this betrothal and the manuscript's patronage was determined by decoding certain visual motifs in its decorative program. And I thought that these motifs could be associated with family names. Oh, actually, I would like to go back. There we go. The first clue to decoding this patronage mystery appears on folio 64 verso in the image depicting the drowning of the Hebrew male infants as decreed by Pharaoh. This is a subject we would expect to see in an illuminated Haggadah, since it explains Moses's unusual childhood, as well as highlighting the suffering of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. As soon as I began working on the manuscript, I took note of the activities taking place in the architectural frames set above the biblical scenes. Set in the frames above the scene, we see two nearly identical confronted bust-length men. Each man reaches back to grasp a long-legged water bird while simultaneously clasping and lifting a fleur-de-lis into the space between them. These figures are prominent, but their origin is not biblical. The second appearance of the fleur-de-lis and what appears to be the same men occurs on folio 73 recto, which depicts the land of Goshen. That's Exodus 8, verse 18. Rather than focusing on the lush grazing lands of Goshen, the artist has presented a looming architectural facade within which one of the men and a veiled woman, witnessed by a second man and a turban figure above, exchange a ring and a fleur-de-lis. Again, there is nothing in Exodus to explain this vignette, which appears to be a betrothal ceremony, which, by the way, follows medieval rabbinic law requiring two witnesses to be present. A heraldic device made famous by the French monarchy, the fleur-de-lis was adopted and used by many in the Middle Ages, both Jews and Christians. But in this Haggadah, the device is used with deliberation. It does not appear to be a decorative element or a shallow status symbol. Could it refer to the family for whom the Haggadah was made? It helps to remember that the fleur-de-lis is a stylized rendering of the lily flower. In fact, the Hebrew word for lily is Shoshana, and it might connect the manuscript to a member of the Ibn Shoshan family, a wealthy and socially prominent clan in medieval Toledo. And what of the long-legged birds, the water birds, who appear in the architectural surrounds of several of the illuminations, and whose wings also grasp were also grasped by the men raising the fleur-de-lis on folio 64 verso. Could these animals be a visual pun on the Hebrew name of another family? Perhaps that of the person marrying into the Ibn Shoshan clan? With their long legs and beaks, the birds closely resemble storks, whose Hebrew equivalent is chasidah, singular chasidot, plural. The word is similar to the word chassid, which means a pious individual. It is also similar to the name Ibn Khazadai, another prominent family in medieval Spain. But wait, it gets even more complicated. Rabbinic commentary connected the storks with the Levites because Moses used the term chasidecha, your faithful one, when he addressed the Levites in his farewell blessing in Deuteronomy 33, verse 8. Perhaps the storks in our manuscript are making reference to the Halevis, another elite family of Jewish Toledo, who appears in numerous medieval documents and were known to have intermarried with the Ibn Shoshans. Now, whether my findings can be replicated in other manuscripts, whether they make sense only in this Castilian example or not at all, remains to be seen. One wonders whether illuminated Haggadot were signed in non-traditional ways, because when it appeared in the late 13th or early 14th century, the illuminated Haggadah was a revolutionary genre, an invented tradition, if you will. For generations, the Haggadah survived in oral form, preserved in the memories of those who chanted it each year at Passover. It was then recorded in relatively unadorned prayer books, only becoming a standalone, illuminated deluxe manuscript in the late 13th century or early 14th century. Given the larger context of Jewish attitudes towards the figural arts and the relative novelty of Hebrew book illumination at the time, the notion that owners might want their Haggadah to convey an impression of legitimacy, if not antiquity, is worthy of explanation. In place of a contemporary colophon, perhaps the numerous rabbinic figures, though surely present in the text, might be thought of as conferring a form of legitimacy to what was then a fledgling, experimental, and perhaps even controversial genre. As the Haggadah states, in each and every generation, a person is obligated to view himself as if he personally came out of Egypt. As I mentioned earlier, this statement presents an intense identification with those who experienced the Exodus as incumbent on every Seder participant and perhaps every art historian working on this manuscript. Today, the obligation to identify has played itself out in ways that ancient sages could never have predicted. Lining the shelves of bookstores, both real and cyber, is a dizzying array of modern Haggadahs pitched to a dizzying array of audience who now can take the ancient directive to a new level. There are Haggadahs for the impatient, for the really impatient, and for the intermarried. There are even Haggadahs for young wizards and the muggles who love them. Looking at the kaleidoscopic variety of modern Haggadahs, each designed to cater to specific tastes, is it any wonder that we expect the same to have been true of Haggadahs copied and illuminated in medieval Iberia? It must be said that later Haggadah owners had little hesitation when it came to modifying medieval manuscripts in their keeping. Indications of later manuscript sales appear as early as 1402 in the case of the Brother Haggadah, which was sold by Meir ben Malachi Ashkenazi to his brother-in-law, Moses ibn Kavash, in the month of Shivan. When Elia Ravia and Rosa Glencoe married in 1602 in Carpi, the armorial devices of their families were added to the Golden Haggadah's already sumptuous decoration. The earliest known owner of the manuscript, Rabbi Yoav Glencoe, also added an elaborate frontispiece to the manuscript on folio 2. This was not the only medieval Haggadah to receive later modifications. At some point, and I think it's here, yes, probably during the Renaissance, someone inserted a well-dressed couple in the loggia depicted on folio 39 verso of the Sarajevo Haggadah. But in the lifetime of their original owners, these indications, if present at all, are detected only with persistent exploration. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you. Those are beautiful images, and much more interesting than we ever knew before we listened to this lecture. I just wanted to get an idea from you of how rare are these medieval Spanish Haggadahs, and how many are there, and how do you think that the ones that we have survived?
Well, we have about at least 25 really well illustrated, well decorated Iberian Haggadah. And I don't know how many we have from Ashkenaz, from the north, a lot as well, but we may, and then they persist even after, in the north, they persist even after printed books start to be developed. Of course, in Spain, everything ends by 1492. And it's quite the interesting mystery is why we don't have really any Haggadot from the 15th century. So even before the Jews are expelled, they seem to stop making illuminated Haggadot. It's an interesting question why. So we have at least 25, and they're illustrated to, illuminated to varying degrees. Some have the narrative sequence, some don't. Some just have an abstract decoration. The Mochada, which has the peacock, has mostly animals and hybrids, all kinds of unusual critters doing things, but doesn't have human figures. So, and there was probably a second half to your question. That's about how many we have. How did they survive?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, like the Hebrew Bibles, they seem to have left with their owners. So we can trace a lot of wherever the Jews went and became Sephardim, like in Venice or Turkey or Sarajevo, places like that, they took these books with them. So that's why they survived. There may have been many more that didn't survive. It's hard to say. We can't make those predictions. But books were precious, and they were also allowed to take books out when they were expelled. Anything metal, anything of precious metal, any money, that sort of thing was confiscated by the Spanish crown. So, so those two things account for their survival. They got passed on. They got some of these books fairly, the Brother Haggadah, I think the Rylands Haggadah, Golden Haggadah. We can trace something of their later provenance. And then sometimes it dries up. But we sometimes know that it fell into other people's hands because people started adding things in, marriages. They started using these books in a way to say something about their family, but that's more of a Renaissance, an early modern thing than a medieval thing.
Are most of them still in, they look like they were just single sheets. Are most of them still in book form?
They're bound, they're all bound. And that's what's revelatory is, for instance, the woman at the table. If you are a careful scholar, you don't just look at the pictures, you also look at how the book was put together. And that image was clearly what they call tipped in. So if you look at how the thing was bound, and there's a very regular way of doing things. And so workshop will always do, choirs of 8 or however, and they fold the parchment a certain way. This is kind of stuck in. So that makes me think it's a deliberate modification of whatever was on spec, if you can think about it that way, for a deliberate reason. So they survive as books. I would tell anybody in the audience who's going to London that the Golden Haggadah and the Barcelona Haggadah are almost always on display at the Ripblatt Gallery in the British Library. It's free. So you just simply walk in there. You can see the Magna Carta. You can see, incredible Christian manuscripts, Quran, Buddhist things, but they always have the Golden Haggadah and the Barcelona Haggadah, unless they're traveling somewhere, which is rare. And unfortunately, you can't turn the pages. You can turn the pages on the website. They are fully digitized. And this is the great thing about digitization, that many of the Hebrew Bibles, you can see behind my head, that's one in Paris, that's a page. So you can just look them up and just sit there and turn the pages. It's not the same as seeing the real thing, but it's pretty darn good. So I encourage you to do that.
Yeah. And before we get to the questions, can you just share a little bit about what is the difference for you between seeing the digital version and leafing through them in person?
I went last summer to see a Bible in Oxford that I'd briefly seen over someone's shoulder. I'd never had it on my desk. And so I'd seen it online. But when I went to see it in person, and I'd already written about it and published it, I could not, the impact of it was extraordinary. The reflection, the feeling of movement, almost the hypnotic quality of it. As you turn the page, you could actually see how it worked to prepare the reader for entering the Bible text. You can imagine that when you're looking on the screen, but it's not the same as holding it in your hands. Another story that has just happened was a manuscript I had written an article about, and one of the reviewers, and my contention was a dark shape in the manuscript, and I explained how I understood it. And my contention was that it was tarnished silver. And the image on the screen just looks dull black. And you can't, because they're taken straight on and digitized. If you actually see the manuscript in person and you see it in a raking light, it becomes apparent that that's silver. So that's the difference. It's images, there's no reflection, it's flattened. You can't get a sense of some of the materiality. A really good manuscript scholar, and I'm not that kind of a person, can, smell the parchment and feel the parchment and really give you a sense, knows a lot about the materiality of the book. And you don't get that on the screen. You only get that by handling the books. But they don't let everybody do it. So
right. Well, most of us will have to make do with the British Library digitized versions.
That's right. Or actually looking at it behind glass at the British Library. Right. That's not too bad. That's not a shabby thing either.
No. That's a great resource though. Thanks for telling us about that. It'd be fun to look at. Okay, we've got a couple questions, and those of you who are still with us, if you have any questions, this is a good time to put it into Q&A. The first question is a comment actually from Beth Shatter, who says, I'm a member of the Jewish Artists Collective Chicago. Our group has created an artist's Haggadah called Out in the Narrows. In it, we interpret the Haggadah text so that it is a midrash rather than a Haggadah with illustrations. Just wanted to inform you about this.
Oh,
I don't know what a midrash is. Could you explain that?
Midrash is it's an interpretation. You are expanding on certain themes, and rabbis would connect one tale to another tale, and one rabbinic story. They say, oh well, the letters of this word mean this, and here it means. So it's almost when you do a drash, is you're like doing a little lecture on something. You're embroidering it, and you're finding the meaning in it. So it's they sometimes involve folk tales. Midrashic legends will tell you little stories that, the story I grew up, when I went to Hebrew school or Sunday school, they told us a story how Moses grabbed the coal. Remember, Moses is supposed to have a speech impediment, how he saw the coal and he put it in his mouth like a baby. And I thought that was from the Bible. And then I went and read the Bible, and there's no story like that. It's a rabbinic midrash. So it's an expansion of what the Bible tells us for all sorts of reasons, for moralistic things, to wrench more meaning out of it, to make it connect intertextuality to other stories in the Bible. That's what midrash is, as opposed to just a very straight linguistic interpretation of, well, this is what this word means. That's what this word means.
Okay, very cool, Beth. Thank you for sharing that with us. And the second thing is from Carol. who brings up the book, People of the Book.
Oh,
by
yeah.
Kristen Brooks, and she wonders if you've read it, and it's
Oh,
about the
yes.
Sarajevo Haggadah. And she says, if you've read it, how realistic was
It's
its
not.
depiction of
No.
research?
No.
No?
And, I get asked that all the time. I actually read it twice because I find it, the first time I read it, you have to read it. And I thought it was pretty good yarn, but from an art historical perspective, it's completely it's a no. It's sort of like, my children tell the story about how anytime the Da Vinci Code came on, I would just become enraged and have to leave the room, So I don't feel quite that way about it, because to get people really interested, and the way I love how you turn the folio and something would fall out, and then she'd tell a story. She'd use as an excuse for going back in time, but no, absolutely not. And it wasn't how books were made, and it wasn't a Black slave who did it. I mean, it just makes no sense art historically. But she tells a really great story, and I love reading her books. And see, I love Caleb's Crossing, about the Native American going to Harvard. And I bet if I were a 17th century scholar, I would probably not love that book. But I don't know enough about 17th century Native American history to criticize it, but I do know a little bit about Haggadot, and enjoy the book, get excited about Haggadot, but it's not there. And in fact, there has been about the Black slave, the image of the slave. That's who she claims is the artist, sitting at the Seder table. There has been a really interesting article about that slave in the last couple of years. If you guys are interested in reading that, scholar, it's not that hard to read. I guess you can contact Grace, and I'll send her a PDF of that article, so you can see just how scholars have dealt with that woman, because she is quite a mysterious woman, and it's kind of cool to see Geraldine Brooks put her in there. But no, it's not historically accurate at all.
Well, thank you for letting us know how real art historians work. And especially for sharing that lovely swooning peacock.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry I couldn't do the whole peacock, but it involved just too much Hebrew. And yeah, but that is being published. So if you really want to dig in, it'll come out in October. I think that's coming out. So.
Okay. Well, October is probably about the time when the second of this series will happen. The art around Thanksgiving. Of course, that'll all be American art, I think.
Yeah.
And much more recent than what we've been looking at tonight. So that'll be also very fun. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. And thank you so much, Julie Harris.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Good night. Thank you for coming.